Welcome to SAM Conversation. I am Tarun Basu, and I'm very happy to have the conversation on the future of India-Australia relations with Lisa Singh, CEO, Australia-India Institute, one of the probably the premier institute on policy research regarding the understanding and the enhancement of Australia-India ties, possibly the one of its kind, and Ambassador Amit Dasgupta, a former ambassador, former Indian Consul General in Sydney, and a strategic advisor to UNSW and its India engagement. Well, this is a very consequential time, if I might put it that way, in more ways than one for India-Australia relations. Australia has a new government. We have just seen another Quad summit with the new Australian PM, Anthony Albanese, in attendance, his first international engagement, possibly a day after he was sworn in. He met Modi in Tokyo, reaffirming their commitment to their comprehensive strategic partnership, and reviewed the progress in their deepening political, economic, defense, security, cyber, technology, energy, environmental, and educational cooperation, whose scope and intensity got enlarged at the last virtual summit in April between the previous Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Modi. So the last decade, we have seen a huge amount of progress in the bilateral ties, which I am sure the Institute has tracked very minutely, driven by both opportunities that it offers and mutual and common challenges. In this current geopolitical context, why is this relationship so important? I would first ask the question to Lisa Singh, and I'd also request her to introduce her a little bit more about herself and the Institute before you get down to the question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tarun, and I'm delighted to join this South Asia Monitor podcast with yourself and with the ambassador. And I think it's a really important topic, particularly now that Australia has a new government in place, for us to talk about the strengthening of the Australia-India relationship under new leadership here in Australia. For me, I am a former Australian senator. I was the first Australian senator of Indian origin in the Australian Parliament, and I'm pleased to see at the outcome of this election there is actually a broader representation of people of South Asian heritage in our Australian Parliament, which is now more reflective, I think, of the Australian population. I was in the Senate until 2019, and during my time in the Senate, I engaged in the foreign policy space, particularly around the bilateral relationship between Australia and India. I had several trips to India and have the privilege of meeting a number of ministers in the Indian government, including Prime Minister Modi, and I was awarded the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman for some of that work in building friendly relations. But I've continued that post-politics in my role here at the Australia-India Institute. We are the only think tank in Australia that is purely focused on the Australia-India relationship. And our focus is across three program areas of geopolitics and security, bilateral economy, and cultural diplomacy. So I'm delighted to join with you and to focus on the importance of our relationship going forward. We're obviously in a very high point at the moment for the Australia-India relationship. And I think that collective strength of both Australia and India aligning, on our shared common beliefs, on our values, and also, of course, on addressing the common threats that we have in the geopolitical sense of the Indo-Pacific region, are ways in which we can continue to strengthen our relationship. Of course, we saw that play out only a couple of days ago. I think it was remarkable that after only one day of being sworn in as Prime Minister, our new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was meeting three significant world leaders the very next day. And one of those, of course, was Prime Minister Modi. And I understand from that meeting that there was a very good meeting, a bilateral meeting between both leaders, where Prime Minister Modi extended an invitation to our Australian Prime Minister to visit India at the most earliest date. And also they reaffirmed their desire to continue that positive momentum in the bilateral relationship, be it on trade or be it on the geopolitical threats that both nations faced. So I see the Australia-India relationship continuing to go from strength to strength under Prime Minister Albanese. I think what was clear is there was a bipartisan agreement on India to continue to do that. So I see it very much so important in terms of Australia's interests, as well as the peace and stability in the region for both of our nations.
Amit, how do you see it from your perch? You're a former diplomat, you've handled bilateral relations from when you were there in Sydney. And now you also were first the country head, and now you're the strategic advisor to this UNSW, the premier university in Australia. How do you see the relations evolving in the coming years, especially with the new government in power?
Thank you, Tarun, and thank you, Lisa, for that very positive enunciation of the relationship and where you feel it might be going, the continued commitment of both countries to strengthen the bilateral space. I am a diehard believer in the bilateral relationship between what I've always said, a subcontinent and a continent. And it did appear to me during my tenure in Sydney somewhat bizarre that India and Australia were not closer partners and that the relationship revolved essentially around cricket, which is not a bad thing, especially if India is winning, but not particularly enjoyable otherwise. But here are two countries and two peoples who I think have shared aspirations. They have shared interests, shared values, but they also have shared concerns. And to draw on Tarun's question, I think one of the big concerns that India faces a challenge, a very difficult time, a very difficult relationship is with China. And with China knocking on our borders, it naturally is a central focus of our foreign policy and our strategic interests, which could be negatively impacted. During the tenure of the former Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, we saw a reasonably hard line. In fact, a surprisingly hardline position vis-a-vis China and China's response to that. Indeed, the overtures China has made to the Solomon Islands immediately before the elections were, I think, a message that they were trying to convey. I mean, the Chinese are always giving messages, aren't they? What, in your view, Lisa, and of course, I'm asking you something uncomfortable because it's still early days. The enunciation of the Anthony Albanese government's foreign policy and security priorities has yet to be done. But how do you see the relationship possibly shaping with China? Do you see continuity, or do you see a shift in and a more nuanced engagement?
Also, if I can add to that, Penny Wong is the new foreign minister, and she, from what I have read, she has been pretty hardline on China in her statements and in her approaches, even as shadow foreign minister. So do you expect any change in approach with respect to dealing with China in the light of new configurations and strategic equations, and especially the kind of pronouncements that were made during the Quad and the joint statement, etc.? Because, the relationship, as Lisa pointed out, was, we're going from strength to strength. She described it as a high point in India-Australia relations. And when the change of government occurred in Canberra, people were a little surprised in New Delhi. So do you see any radical change in policy shifts towards India or this South Asia with this new Labour government in power?
Is that a
Well,
question
thank
to me
you.
or to Lisa?
Yeah, to Lisa, to a question to
Okay.
Lisa.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Well, thank you both of you for those very important questions. And I think it's really worth unpacking the China relationship for Australia, both in terms of the bilateral relationship, but also in terms of our relationship with India and in terms of the Quad. So just on the Quad, firstly, I think what is clear is that yes, the Quad has made a lot of progress as a sort of security grouping, but of course it's broadened out its agenda now to look at all sorts of areas of humanitarian assistance, supply chain resilience, and cybersecurity, climate change. I think China's growing assertiveness demands that the Quad grouping move with a much more greater urgency. You know, I think as the Quad looks to sort of cooperate and coordinate in the face of these sort of global crises, be it China or be it Russia in its invasion in Ukraine, I think in terms of that, as China increases its military presence and assertiveness, particularly across the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific itself, as we're seeing right now, then the Quad must develop a much more robust security agenda, you know, if it seeks to sustain itself and the region in the coming years. And I think it did start to show that at this Leaders Summit that has happened just this week. But there's clearly a lot more work to do for the Quad and at that level. If I can just move now to Australia and under this new leadership of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, he's made it clear that Australia hasn't changed, it's China that has changed. And I think what we saw under the previous government here in Australia is that relations with China were pretty much characterised more by disagreements with China than sort of any sort of diplomatic advances. And of course, they did deteriorate around the banning of the 5G Huawei network out of Australia. I think it was to do with, calling for an inquiry into the pandemic. We saw out of some of those actions this sort of assault by China of subsequent trade sanctions from Beijing on a range of Australian exports, which has really had an impact here on Australia. And I think that whilst China's premier, congratulated Prime Minister Albanese on his election victory with the acknowledgement of a letter, I think, yes, it may be significant in the sense of, it marks the end of a 2-year diplomatic freeze between Canberra and Beijing. I think at the same time, what we want to see is a little bit more than that, than a congratulatory letter from China. We want to see those sanctions lifted. And I think that should be a focus of this new Albanese government. The other part of that, of course, is the Pacific. And I think the new Prime Minister was right to describe the Solomon Islands China Security Pact as a Pacific stuff-up. I mean, China is now pursuing a region-wide Pacific Islands agreement as we sweep. It's a sweeping policy to lock Pacific Island states into sort of Beijing's orbit. And this is going to be a huge test for the new government. I mean, they've only just been sworn in, and our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, is now headed to Fiji to resolve and focus on this. And I think what we saw under the previous government, it was a bit of a dropping of the ball in relation to that. And now, obviously, the threat of China and its sort of footprint growing in the Pacific. I think Labor, on the Labor government's sort of focus in terms of the Indo-Pacific, again, it does have a focus on ASEAN or on Southeast Asia. And I think that makes a lot of sense, but it's an area in which India and Australia can continue to work together on. I think it's important when we talk about India and Australia wanting a free and open and stable Indo-Pacific region that operates under an international rules-based system, that we talk about that for the entire region, not for just each other. And therefore, a focus on Southeast Asia, a focus on the Pacific is something both India and Australia can come together on. And I think I saw that coming out of Prime Minister Modi, for example, at the recent COP26 meeting, where he put forward a proposal supported by Australia to support the small island states, to support the Pacific in relation to climate change infrastructure. Now, this is something that would be very welcomed by this new Australian government, because they also have a strong focus on climate change. And it's something that both of our countries can work together on for each other, but also for the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region.
Trade and investment, as you pointed out, would be a major dimension of this Indo-Australian relationship. In fact, a lot of the differences with China arose over trade and investment issues. Now, this trade negotiation sometimes can be very long-winding and can go on for years, if not decades. But compared to the earlier history, the new round of negotiations on the FTA started in that September 2021, produced very quick results. And India and Australia signed that Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement on 2nd April 2022, while reaffirming the commitment to CICA, as Amit pointed out, by end of 2022. What changed this time? I mean, these negotiations were going on for, I think, 10 years or 15 years. What suddenly changed, and what was the urgency, and how did the two countries agree to most of these and iron out most of these differences in trade and the trade and investment issues?
Look, I think I've said a number of times that the trade and investment relationship with India and Australia has been very undercooked for a very long time. And that really comes back to the fact that Australia has just relied on its very strong free trade agreement with China and the huge burgeoning trade relationship it's had with China for over a decade now. And it should not be because of the sanctions that China has placed on Australia that we start to pivot to India. We should be doing it anyway, because India has the fastest growing economy in the world. It will continue to grow, and there are so many, shared interests for both of our countries to work together to have a much more stronger trade and investment footing. The recent signing of the interim Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, known as ECTA, or one would say Unity in Hindi, is only an interim agreement, but it is a massive start for our two countries. And it's the signalling that comes out of such a trade agreement, which is so important. Of course, it does include some of the areas of lifting tariffs of some of those areas that China puts sanctions on Australia on, in terms of wine, seafood, sheep meat, for example. But it's more than that. It is about a very long, protracted effort over about a decade to try and get our two countries to see that we can have a stronger bilateral relationship based on trade. And I think that's what's so insignificant and important here. Now, of course, it doesn't end there. The commitment that's been made by both countries, and there's a bipartisan position on this with the new Australian government, is to actually have a full-blown free trade agreement by Christmas. So that's going to take an incredible amount of work, because I know there was a lot of work to get to this interim free trade agreement. But the idea of it, and this is where the Institute comes in, because we recently hosted India's Trade and E-commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, with the previous Australian Trade Minister, Dan Tehan, where Minister Goyal made it clear that whilst the commitment currently is to sort of reach 50 billion between both countries by 2025, he actually said, why don't we double that? Why don't we make it 100 billion? Now, I am all for that. And I think, Australian farmers, Australian producers, and in India as well would all be for that. But even on that level, it is still dwarfed compared to our ongoing trade relationship with China. So despite the freeze in our relations, the two-way trade relationship with China in 2020 was 250 billion. It is still way ahead of where we could be with India. So we've got a long way to go, I think, in terms of our two countries building our trade relations. And I think in that, this is where it's exciting under Albanese's government, because he does have a focus on renewable energy. And I know that India wants to diversify its its energy sources into looking at more renewables. So there's areas for growth that are new markets that we can develop. The other is the tech sector. Australia has a tech story to tell, and so does India. India has a massive tech story. There's more engineers coming out of India and going to the tech sector than anywhere else in the world. So I think there's lots of areas for growth other than what has been agreed to in this interim ECTA. And I think that they're worth exploring now under this new Australian government.
Thank you. Amit, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I'm thoroughly enjoying what Lisa's saying, I'm just trying to act as the devil's advocate on this, and to say that during my tenure as Consul General, the difficulty that I faced was that while there was an overall appreciation from both sides, actually, that there was a huge untapped potential, it was accompanied by a sense of reticence, both from Indian business and industry, which said that, look, Australia is so far away, it has just a population of about, at that time, 23 million people. It's much better for us to go somewhere else. And the Australian side felt that doing business with India was going to be extremely challenging. And consequently, I think both sides, while they had good intentions and hand on the heart, so to speak, it never really translated into action. And I believe today that the role of the Australia-India Institute is actually a very critical one. There is a lack of clarity, for instance, both in India and in Australia among the business community on what it means in doing business with India and what does it mean in doing business with Australia. And, the various rules of entry requirements, of the paperwork that needs to be done, the bureaucracy, the income tax regulations, how exactly do you do business? And I think the Australia-India Institute can play a very powerful role in this. And just to go back to what Lisa said, among the priorities of the Institute, one of them really was cultural diplomacy, which is getting to know each other. And I think foreign policy gets strengthened when it is based on relationship building. And relationship building can't just be between governments. It has to be with multiple stakeholders. So that's my, let's say, immediate reaction to what Lisa said. I totally agree with what she said. I'm just seeing the possibilities of taking the next step, which is really a responsibility that all of us have in strengthening the Australia-India Institute, in allowing the people of both sides, especially business and industry, and of course the civil society, in knowing each other better, knowing the laws, the regulations, the processes, the procedures much better, the customs duties involved, how does it all work? I mean, how do you do business in India? I think that's a tough question.
Yeah, look, can I just add to what you've said? I think it's something that I talk about a lot here at the Institute to business and to other stakeholders, which is, it's basically India literacy is what we're talking about. We need businesses to be more India literate. We work very hard to break down the old perception of India as being hard to do business in. We know that India itself has gone through all sorts of regulatory reforms to make doing business in India easier. There are a number of Australian companies now taking that challenge. And one of the things I would say to any Australian business that wants to do business in India, and I encourage them to do so, is to find a local partner. I've just come back from a month in India, talked to a number of businesses. They're up to engaging with Australian businesses, to showing them those sorts of ropes, to learn that sort of navigation that one might need in India. And I think the same thing needs to be said to Indian businesses operating in Australia. I mean, we have quite a complex regulatory system ourselves here. I think both countries have got their levels of bureaucracy cut out for them. But, at the same time, the will has to be there. And I think at the moment, what we can see in the Australia-India relationship, at least, is a strong will. And that's where I think the role of this institute and being a facilitator for business, for government, is so incredibly important. One of the ways that we will do that this year is by hosting an Australia-India Leadership Dialogue in New Delhi in September. It's a track 1.5 dialogue. So it's ministers, it's CEO of companies, where they can come together to actually see how they can strengthen the relationship and overcome some of the geopolitical challenges, the trade and investment challenges that both nations might face. This is incredibly important, not just in an economic sense. We know that obviously economic growth lifts people out of poverty. It's so important for both of our countries, but also for peace and stability in our region, to say to our region and to the world, here are two democratic nations that want to work closer together, that have, long history of colonial ties that they're sort of letting go of, and now becoming, contemporary countries that want to really drive our two nations forward on really important areas of climate change, of humanitarian assistance in the region through the post-pandemic activities of vaccines being available, and ensuring we lift people out of poverty by providing them with work and dignity. So I think these are really exciting times for both our countries, but the will has to be there. And I think what we saw out of the Quad only a couple of days ago is, after a new Prime Minister being sworn in, he's on a plane, he's in Tokyo, and he's meeting Prime Minister Modi, talking about exactly this. And I'm really excited for what that means for both of our nations under this new leadership.
That's very well put, Lisa. And you spoke about the visit, very important visit of the Indian Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal to Australia recently. And I read when he visited the UNSW Sydney, he talked about education acting as a bridge between India and Australia. And that's an important and evolving component of the relationship, which I think we should spend a few minutes talking about. Couple of, I don't know, at least 2 or 3 Australian universities have now presence in India, strong presence, and they have growing partnerships with Indian universities and campuses. So how can, Amit talked about cultural diplomacy, how can culture and education, play a role in bringing the two countries, the two democracies even closer on the kind of growth path that you just talked about and initiated? Lisa?
Oh, that's for me.
Yeah.
Look, here, as you know, the Institute is located at the University of Melbourne. My recent trip to India, actually, I was accompanied for the first part of the trip by a delegation of 20 academics from the University of Melbourne who really want to engage a lot more and partner a lot more with universities in India. I mean, this is a growth area for both of our countries. And I touched on the tech sector before. I mean, tech is one area in terms of engineering and IT that we both, as two countries, need to ensure we have a lot more uptake in graduates coming out of, because the tech sector is continuing to expand and grow. I had a very good meeting while in India with your IT minister, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, about this exact fact. How are we going to ensure we have more grads coming out to deal with this demand of tech jobs that we have coming forward? That's one area. But I think overall, here at the Institute, we're pleased to host interns who are Indian students, to make them feel welcome and a part of, obviously Australia, but also the university culture, and also to connect back to India as well and feel a sense of their home. I think, education is a flagship sector. Peter Varghese, who wrote our India Economic Strategy, which is known as our blueprint for the relationship, he made it the flagship sector, and it continues to be so. It's an area where we can have an incredible amount of growth if we ensure there is more student mobility, but also, I think in the Australian sense, also that there's a path for employment for some time at the end of their degrees. And I know that this is also being looked at by the new government. I think, more engagement with students is only going to be a good thing for both of our nations. And that includes Australian students actually going to India and partnering with Indian universities.
Amit, do you want to add something to that? And also, probably we have covered a fair amount of ground. I think we are running out of time. And would you like to round up this discussion, please?
Yeah, Tarun, I think that this has been a fantastic interview, and I totally agree with Lisa in terms of the clarity with which she enunciated the international education space. And the only thing I'd add is that education is not and should not be a one-way movement of Indian students to Australia. Of course, that's very important and it should be encouraged. I call it the push factor and the pull factor combined together. Australia has some outstanding universities. Indian students who are high achieving students are aspiring for state-of-the-art knowledge. So this is a good thing. But it can't just be a one-way movement of students. I think international education collaboration needs to be also part of relationship building. And Australian institutions and Indian institutions need to combine their strengths to transform lives, to meet the grand challenges that both Australia and India face, whether it's on developmental issues, on climate change, on waste management, water management, solar and photovoltaics, on quantum computing, cybersecurity. There's a whole range, oncology, child cancer. And this final point I'd say, linked to this, is that if you were to ask an Indian vice chancellor, can you name 5 Australian authors? They would find it very difficult to do so. And similarly, if you were to ask Australian students and faculty, can you name 5 Indian authors who have international repute? They would struggle to name 5 people. And I think part of our literacy program, India literacy, Australia literacy, is to enhance this, to improve this, because it's only when we improve it that relationship building would be on strong footing. But it's fantastic speaking with Lisa and with you as always, Tarun.
Between Amit, what you said and what Lisa had said earlier, Lisa is a former politician, you are a former diplomat. Between the two, you covered a fantastic amount of ground in the terms of the scope and potential and dimensions of the bilateral relationship. To use a cliche, only the sky is the limit in the way Australia and India relations can go forward under this new government. And we have covered a lot of ground, and we haven't even touched the common passion for cricket, which would probably need a separate conversation. I think Australians formed one of the largest contingents of this edition of the IPL, and there's more cricket coming, bilateral and multilateral, later this year. And fans of both countries will keep rushing to either the stadiums or the TV screens, as the T20 World Cup is there in Australia in October. So I think there was a very fruitful discussion, the first of the discussions, and I think we could do this again in the future. So thank you, Lisa Singh, and thank you, Amit Dasgupta, for coming together on this Assam platform and enlightening our audience on this. And really appreciate this, and we all learned a lot from each other, and looking forward to more such engagements. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tarun. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.